Hello everyone, I hope you're having a good day. We had some classic freezing rain this week where you could skid everywhere, but now it's sunshine and beautiful. And my wife went to England yesterday to escape her husband for a while, no, to go and visit her friends and family. So, what am I going to talk about today? First of all, for those of you new, I am a retired professor, technically working in pediatrics and biochemistry, primarily concerned with nutrition at a cellular level, what it does to cell membranes. I ceased doing that shortly before retirement because students had discovered that I thought Christianity was true, to their astonishment. And then when they started arguing with me, they found they lost. So they said, you need to do more of this. And I sort of said, well, no. There are lots of better people for this than me. But here I am, 30 years later, still doing it. So when this will stop, I don't know. I'm getting a little older. But it only appears to validate not taking exercise. But apart from that, all is well. What am I going to talk about today? I want to talk about the things your kids and your grandchildren have really got to understand if you're going to let them go to university. I'd let them go to a community college to learn a trade before I'd let them go to university. If they're going to go to university, they must be able to take on the opposition. So that's what I want to talk about today. I promised at the end of the last podcast, so I'll start with that rather than the Sermon on the Mount. We'll see how far we get. I went to university quite naive in many respects, although having had a superb education by grace. I got translated to one of the best schools in England from a working class background because of politics, basically. I was affirmative action, if you like. Suddenly finding myself in a class where, apart from the one other boy who was affirmative action, everybody else had some working function with French and Latin, and we didn't. So we had a little catching up to do. But that happened all right. But most importantly, my homeroom master in American terms, North American terms, spoke 5 languages. And I thought, wow, is that normal? Well, of course, it isn't for school teachers these days, but it was at that school then. Anybody who wasn't teaching science would have basically 5 languages that they could handle. An astonishing new world. I was only a pre-pubertal boy, so I just enjoyed it. A bit overawed at times, but not inhibited too much. And I didn't know it, but the moment I went to that school, my future was changed. That I would go to university unless I chose not to, in the days when only 3 or 4% of the population went, and I could go wherever I wanted pretty well. I didn't know that. And I ended up doing medicine in London, where the most important thing that happened was I met my wife. Both of us like to argue we're both always right, which is going to make our Alzheimer's, when it comes, rather difficult to handle. We're not sure how we're going to do that, but maybe the good Lord knows what he's going to do, and we won't have to go through that. But so many of our friends are. I should talk about that a bit at some point. But we have always argued, and the arguing has been productive. We say the only text in the Bible that describes our marriage is iron sharpens iron. Sparks fly. They're usually creative. Because I sit back and dream, and she's an activist, so it's very dangerous for me to say I could do X or Y, because I'll find myself doing it very quickly. That was good. All the best choices. The choice to take a break from medicine, having got all the exams out of the way, including boards, in American terms, or membership in the British terms. But in Britain, they don't give you a consultant job until you're 30, and I was, 26? Less than 26, 25 when I got it all done, I think. So we weren't going to have kids, but we were careless. So shortly we had 3, and she said, I need more help. And can't you work different hours for a bit? And I said, well, I'm bored. I'll do a PhD. So I did a PhD to see my kids. And I loved it, going home at regular times instead of what internal medicine is like. On one occasion, my wife stuck her elbow into my ribs at about 8 o'clock in the morning and said, "Why are you still in bed?" And I said, "I've been up all night." She said, "No, you haven't." She sleeps like a log. And I said, "I have." And she was about to argue when the telephone went, and it was a call from the hospital. I'd got up in the middle of the night, driven into hospital, put in a pacemaker, come back, and had just fallen asleep. And fortunately, it was the ward with a question. So that kind of life is hard on the kids and the wife, so to speak. So Sally persuaded me, and I applied for and got a personal fellowship, and that was another 3 or 4 years accounted for, which would get me to a stage where I could make a career choice. But by the time I'd finished my work, Sally said, "I enjoy this life much better than the one where you go out before the kids are awake and come back when they're asleep. So can't you do some more like this in a nice place?" And the net result was, because of what I'd been doing academically, with the help of the two of us, Philip Hilden and myself, had invented a new technique, and that meant that I could attack some problems that nobody else in the world could. And so I went to Wellcome Trust, told them what I could do, and the problem I'd found was malnutrition. And that's another story. I'll do a podcast on malnutrition if people write and say they want it. I won't do it otherwise, or email and say they want it. Anyway, we ended up going to Jamaica for 2 years, and we stayed for nearly 7, and it was a wonderful experience. When that was over, I was supposed to come back to a job in London, and Mrs. Thatcher cancelled the funding. So the trust was embarrassed. They said, "We'll pay your salary while you find a job, which won't take you long." I didn't even look. I went on holiday. That's what I really wanted to do. And when I got back, there were 2 offers, and net result was we ended up in North America, cross-appointed academically between biochemistry and pediatrics, and that was fine. But we were both Christian. We went to church. We realized that without the help of church and a small group, which was critical to getting through those early difficult years of marriage, we weren't active enough. The small group was good. I mean, we had a wonderful set of friends there who came from very diverse and rich backgrounds, so it helped. But when we went off to Jamaica, if I'd been accused of being a Christian in an academic environment, it would have been difficult to find the evidence, put it that way. So I knew the story was true. I'd never disbelieved it. I mean, it takes far more faith to be an atheist than to be a Christian. And now, of course, it's even harder to be an atheist than a Christian, as you can see with all these clever people eventually realizing they've been wrong for most of their lives. I'm glad they got there in the end. But I was like most Christians, so. If you asked me, I'd say yes, I believed it, but it wasn't something that dominated my life. It wasn't as central as it should have been. And again, it was students who helped. My uneducated parents had certainly educated me Christianly better than I was doing for my kids. So we went to the nearest church in Jamaica that had students going to it. It turned out to be a little Brethren church, which was the background I came from, so that didn't bother me. In fact, one of the reasons we went is a network had been activated by my mother, and 48 hours after we arrived in Jamaica, a wonderful couple drove up, found out where we were on the campus, and came and said hello and invited us to church. And we're still friends. I mean, they're dead now, but their daughter is still on our list of visitors when we go to Jamaica. So off we went to church, and I was appalled to realize that the students coming from evangelical backgrounds on smaller islands were utterly unprepared for what they were going to face, because it was the heyday of Castro. The Marxists were making huge gains everywhere on campus, and Christianity was just passé, no importance. And they didn't know how to deal with it. And I had a Marxist grandfather. I had been behind the Iron Curtain, and I knew exactly where I'd realized what was wrong with Marxism on a cliff face in the Czech Republic, as it was then. And so I brought them home to lunch, and we talked on patio most of Sunday afternoon. And I have several friends to this day from those discussions on the porch. It was the first time that I had really understood that young Christians needed someone like me to help them adjust if they're going to academic environments. One of the guys who was in that group is retired now as a professor from the University of the West Indies. An astonishing thought, really. But I go back to Jamaica regularly until COVID came along, and it's been a bit more irregular now, but hopefully I'll have a few more visits. So, what did we talk about? Well, here's my list of things that you need to be able to talk about. The list can vary a bit. Maybe I should tell you the history of how it came about. When I went to university, I was converted into a reductionist without the word being used. And I suspect that, sadly, many of you listening to me would have difficulty in saying what reductionism is and why it matters to Christians. If you do know all those answers, then you don't need to listen to me. You need to go out, get to work with what you know, because if you're in a church, the young people mustn't leave that church without knowing what it's all about. So reductionism, I maintain, is the major problem, and we're not dealing with it. A lot of people are realizing we're at a stage of cultural crisis, as the left always describe it as crisis, but I would say we're in a stage of cultural decay, but we're not beyond redemption. And you can see it happening amongst the intellectual elite, which is fascinating. But what fascinated me when I got to university was the science, really. I loved the science aspect of the training. And that converted me into a reductionist without any attempt at conversion, if you like. I began to think if it couldn't be measured, it wasn't important. I mean, you only have to stop and think for 30 seconds to realize that's stupid. But you don't do that at that stage. You have people teaching you who clearly believe that, and they're much smarter than you, so you're not going to argue with them. And they didn't ever use the word because they'd been got at before me. And when you trace it backwards, you end up actually as far back to the start of the story as the late 13th century. A very suitable starting point is 1277. You can find the reasons for that in the best introduction to the history of science in the Western world by David Lindbergh, but it's a thick book. Only if you're very interested is it worth you getting. The easier way for those of you who are a bit lazier than that, or let's be kinder, who have not sufficient time to do that, is to go back to, name block at the moment. I'm actually after, this is so important. No, I can't look it up on my shelf so I can remember the author. He was from Baylor. He taught sociology. Rodney Stark, yeah. Rodney Stark has written a little book which talks about the beginnings of science, and he deals with science and many other issues. He was a sociologist brilliantly. So you get a summary of, a précis of David Lindbergh's book in one chapter, God's Handiwork. Why is it so important? He found when he started doing the sociology of religion that he was lacking the understanding he needed. Of course, you take that degree of interest in a subject, you're going to get changed by it. And eventually, he was changed. He became a Christian because he looked at the history. We are very deeply rooted in history, or at least we should be. Now we don't bother with it. And what happened to Israel every time they forgot their history? They screwed up. They did it a dozen times. And then they were brought back by the grace of God. All other cultures, it seems to me, get one shot at the top position, so to speak. America is there at the moment. Whether it maintains that position will be very dependent upon whether it learns to honour its history and to know its history. We'll have more to say about this as we go along in this talk, which is getting out of hand already, but you're used to that. So, what happened in 1277? Well, there was no real science from way back. I mean, mathematics and astronomy were done. They're special cases in many respects. Aristotle taught us logic, deductive logic. He also knew about inductive logic, but he wanted deductive. And he was one of the smartest men who ever lived. And he knew it. So he didn't bother to do experiments. He simply thought, and his thoughts were better than experiments. So obviously, rocks fell in proportion to their weight. He only needed to go to the nearest cliff to find out that wasn't true, but he didn't do that. And he was such an icon that even when Galileo demonstrated his telescope to some Jesuits and showed that Aristotle was wrong, the moon was not a perfect sphere, it was pockmarked. And one Jesuit scientist said, no instrument can undo the work of the divine Aristotle. Well, really, that's authority for you. But, of course, Galileo was right and the Jesuit was wrong on that occasion. Most of the time, the Jesuits are not wrong, but they can be a little proud too. So, what had happened, of course, was that we'd had all those centuries of learning, philosophy, logic, mathematics, astronomy, but no experiments, not in a systematic way. There were some attempts in the Islamic world when they got hold of the Aristotelian corpus, and then it was translated into. They did a wonderful job of translation in the Eastern Mediterranean in the what it would be 8th, 9th centuries, that sort of time. And the church split around the 10th century and went east and west. The west was speaking Latin and the east was speaking Greek, and never trying to communicate. I mean, communication was difficult those days. So Europe was backwards of primitive thought and warring fiefdoms, whereas Islam was a powerful empire which oppressed all that was in his way, and they either became Muslims or second-class citizens. And not surprisingly, most of them chose to become Muslim, at least in name. So, but the imams, now as then, were a problem intellectually. So the best place to be if you had your interests in were intellectual is at the periphery. You didn't want to be anywhere near the theological center. So the best place was Spain, one place where Jews, Christians, and Muslims talked to one another about what they were doing and what they were thinking. You also had out in the other direction, the eastern end. Again, I've got name block at the moment for the very great Islamic scholar who read everything in the masters. His father worked for a local sheikh sort of thing, and the sheikh had collected books, and the boy read them all. And it was quite, even as a boy, told the teacher, I know this better than you do. Quite astonishing. He also drank a bottle of wine every day when he grew up, but he could do that. He was in a world of his own. But way off in Spain, Jews, Christians, and Muslims were talking. The Christians came, of course, over the Pyrenees into Spain. Not many of them. You can find a beautiful account of this in Hannam's book on the beginnings of Western science. But one of the guys who came over and learnt all this Aristotelian stuff was later to become a pope. But he took the stuff back. Now, Europe was just coming to life. This would be 10th century or thereabouts. And the works of the major Islamic scholars, Averroes and Avicenna in their Latinized names, or Ibn Sina and Ibn Rushd in their Muslim names, their work was being discussed, translated. So it came over the Pyrenees and into Europe, which was beginning to be, well, it was now ready. Now, one of the things that needs to be said, especially to our brothers and sisters in the developing world, the third world, the world, the underprivileged world in many ways, is that the journey from a pagan culture, of a fatalistic culture, which, apart from Jews and Christians, all other cultures have a very deep streak of fatalism in them at one level or another. And that is a problem, and it doesn't go away quickly. England was blessed to have the gospel come to it in the first century, but it didn't really take off. And it was 5 centuries later that the Pope sent some missionaries, and they went with much trepidation, because this was when war was the norm, and when it wasn't internal, you'd have the Vikings and the Norsemen coming and raiding and murdering and stealing and taking the women away. That's who they were. That's the way the world was. But when these missionaries came, the Pope of the time was very wise, and he said, don't preach for a year at least. Set up your own community, your own way of life. Let them see how you love one another, how you are in fact brothers. And they will be intrigued. And they were. And gospel level 1, you realize that you're screwed up inside, and that Jesus came to solve that problem. And if you entrust your life to him, things happen. And they happened. So the gospel went as far as the Scots border quite quickly. But, and this important point, it was several centuries before Alfred was able to bring the warring tribes together and establish England. And he was Christian. The first thing he did when he became king was translate some of the Bible from Latin to the vernacular. And he and his sons were good kings. Alfred, probably the best king we ever had. And from that, we began to get the beginnings of Judeo-Christian culture. The simplistic anti-colonialist rubbish, which is has no historical depth to it. Of course, the colonists were late. Before that, there were no nations. There were imperial empires, and they made the Brits look like namby-pambys in terms of their lack of use of the power they had. And the European nations, who were really only interested in getting the raw materials that they wanted, but they did also do some educating because it was in their interest to do it. So they did bring things like roads and a better system of health, some education. There were many things done wrong, but let's not fail to recognize that critical things happen, and then to realize from the point where a pagan tribe becomes Christian through conversion. And when it first comes, it's astonishing to talk to people who've experienced that. You're looking at centuries before you begin to see the emergence of ways of developing society that are profitable for everyone. I mean, economies didn't really take off until the 18th century, end of the 18th century, and then exponential growth. But even then, I mean, even in Britain, the takeoff for the economy didn't happen till on a big scale till the 20th century. The curve is flat, and then there's this incredible takeoff worldwide. Ideas have consequences, but they're very slow to come. So what happened as slowly this happened in Europe, and the first intellectual universities, as opposed to theological colleges, which or theological training, the madrasas of the Muslim world, the universities as we know them didn't emerge really until about the 12th century. In Italy, in Paris, in Oxford, Cambridge, that's when it happened. Now, when Aristotelian material came back in the 10th century, they were the trigger that led to this, because the scholars that were there, and remember, no printing press, everything copied by hand. Read the Place of the Rose if you want to get some sense of what it was like, even when the monasteries were established to a degree. The Name of the Rose, Place of the Rose, Name of the Rose. It was worrying for some people. I mean, Paul tells you to beware of philosophers. My mother's last comment to me going to university was to quote that verse from Colossians, I think it is, beware of philosophers. And she's right. Paul was right. They're dangerous, most of them, most of the time, and arrogant to boot, because they are smart. So they just latched onto this Aristotelian stuff, and away they went. And the stories, there's some colourful characters involved, and the usual sex, no drugs, but sex and sharp minds are not separated. The church had to deal with it as best it could. But the Bishop of Paris, who was in charge of the University of Paris, he was worried. So he put a temporary ban on the use of Aristotelian deductive logic. Oxford didn't take any notice. I doubt that there was much notice taken in Paris, but the bishop was in charge, so they had at least to make some sort of nominal commitment to obeying him. And I think when they were told, look, we need to examine this new Aristotelian stuff before you go scattering all over the land, they were not happy, because what Aristotle had given them was a structure from which they could teach their own ideas, which is what academics do all the while. They've developed the structure to suit themselves, not to suit the truth or you. Try reading Judith Butler if you want an example of just how obscure they can be and how dangerous. Give her prizes, call her the greatest feminist ever, and you can't read her prose because it's so turgid. But the impact she's had, sending out all these people who think they're smart, as they've done in England, to celebrate Ramadan and ban Easter. Really? Yeah, that's happening. So I think the profs had to get together and talk about it. And what they came up with was ultimately reductionism. But their first question was, what are we going to do? They would like to go on teaching Aristotelian deductive logic, but that would be too blatant. But I think something like, I've no proof of this. This is me using artistic license, if you like, because something like this must have happened. I suspect they all got together, or at least some of them did, and talked about their problem, and then somebody had the smart idea. They were all Christian. There was no other game in town. So they would say something like this. We were told in Genesis that the world was to be dominated by us, but not in an oppressive sense, but in the sense of being a steward. We were supposed to be in charge of nature and of the animals and of everything else. They were to be under us, and we were to be under God. But they would say, we haven't made much progress, have we? Our so-called science doesn't give us much control over nature. There were some little shoots appearing, but nothing very striking, apart from the logic of Aristotle and the Greeks now back in circulation in Europe. And they said, well, we can't do Aristotelian deductive logic, but what about inductive logic? You can either start an argument from the big premise and try and get down to the details of everyday life and how they work. Long journey, you get lost on the way. Too big a project in most cases for our tiny minds. But what about the other way around? They had delivered ideas like rocks fall in proportion to their weight without ever checking it. But what if we try and understand better some little things instead of the big ones? The classic would be Galileo a couple of centuries later, rather more than a couple, when he started rolling a ball down a polished plank to see what happened. Because according to Aristotle, when you throw something, it has impetus imparted and it goes like this, and when it runs out, it drops. Now, of course, Galileo was interested in helping gunners. And so he looked, and when it came off the end of the plank, if there was space, of course it was a parabola. It didn't do what Aristotle said it should do. But that was going to take some time to come. And it came because he was experimenting. He was starting with something very small. He polished the plank vigorously to get rid of friction. And then he could change the angle and play with variables that he could actually measure. And of course, that was the beginning of real science. Ultimately, he put a man on the moon. That's where it really started. But back to the first real experiments. I mean, they talked about it. They must have tried a little bit, but it didn't really take off until the 14th century. So 13th century, the intellectual change, the world changed its idea of where to start, didn't really know how to go about it. And then in Oxford, they did some real experiments. And they drew the first graph without knowing what they'd done. They arrived at velocity, which Aristotle had never done. He could only think in terms of how much time to go that distance or how much distance you could go in that time, with never arriving at the idea of speed, which to us seems incredible for the smartest mind in the world. But so be it. I mean, lots of apples had fallen, but it was only Newton who realized how important that was. Once you had the thought, you were underway. By the way, in that phrase, underway, it's W-E-I-G-H, not W-A-Y. I won't tell you why. You can think about it. I was once corrected by an editor, and I said, no, you're wrong. I'm right, and explained to him why. But the world was underway when they started doing those experiments. Now, fortunately, I think providentially in the long run, Oxford was a Franciscan university, and one of the people who was there when these experiments were happening, with the names of half a dozen scientists that ought to be celebrated and are not even known by most people, even though they have wonderful names like Swine's Head. But he was watching these experiments, and he was a very smart man. His writing, I'm told, in Latin is very difficult, so his name was William of Ockham. That's where Occam's razor comes from, but by the time it's Occam's razor, they spell it O-C-C-A-M, but it should really be O-C-K-H-A-M, because William of Ockham was the village of Ockham in Surrey, from which he came. But so be it. It doesn't really matter what the name is, and it doesn't matter that people don't like it. Nevertheless, things changed. And he was smart enough to see that if this science works, and it looked to him as though it was going to, then this is going to be a problem for the church as they think about authority. They can't just ex cathedra pronounce on everything, which is what they like to do. I mean, at the moment, academics are trying to persuade us that gender is a social construct. Try telling that to somebody who's growing cattle for the market. As one of my neighbours said, if I found my cows going homosexual, I'd soon get rid of them because there wouldn't be any calves to sell. No, it's nonsense, but that's what academics do. They get away with it a lot of the time. Now, in this particular case, the work that started in Oxford, in Merton College, went across the channel to France, and two main people there, Buridan and Nicolas Resme. It's strange, I can remember a name from that far back, and I've had at least one name that I couldn't pull out of the bag at the right time in this lecture. Such is life. But Buridan was extremely smart, and so was Resme. Resme was also the Bishop of Paris, and he was smart in the political sense. So he came to the conclusion that the sun is the centre of our solar system, and it doesn't go around the Earth goes around it. But he was smart enough to realise that that will be difficult for my fellow bishops to understand. So he proposed it as merely a technical advance because the calculations are easier if you try and do it on that model. And he got away with that. Descartes got his hands on it and did what Descartes does. And then it crossed back to Francis Bacon, who changed the meaning of the word fact. Up until that moment, so to speak, facts were divided between moral facts and physical facts. And which were the more important? The moral facts. Newton was the last scientist to believe that moral facts are more important than physical facts. But Bacon gave it the push to say, go after physical facts, things you can measure. And if you can't measure it, don't bother with it because it's not going anywhere. And of course, at one level, it was true. I mean, in an incredibly short period of time, Copernicus, Galileo and Kepler, Newton, they changed the whole Aristotelian cosmos into a new one and set up 300 years of physics. I mean, Newton was eventually displaced by Einstein, but it's not that he was wrong, but it's a limited case of 1G and thereabouts. Astonishing what happened. Nothing like it had ever happened before. Doctors had existed for all those centuries, not because they could do anything about your health, the odd thing here and there, but no systematic success except in one thing. Which we're now, of course, removing from medicine to a large degree because we want all doctors to be treated as widgets. Everyone is easily replaced by another one who's the same, but they're not, of course. What happens is all about the question of prognosis. You go to the doctor because you don't feel well. And doctors see lots of patients. So if there's an epidemic going around, they say, oh no, you just got the epidemic. You'll feel better in a week or two. And he turns out to be right on that, so he has some authority. He also knows when he's got the evidence of something. He doesn't have any proper understanding, but he's seen it before and he knows it's bad news. So he can tell you that too, and he's right again. They went to the doctor for prognosis. I usually say it wasn't until the 1860s that going to the doctor correlated with living longer. Their treatments, such as they were bad. I mean, even an American president was almost certainly had his life, Washington I think it was bled too much by an enthusiastic doctor who loved taking blood off people. Thinking, I mean, well-intentioned, but not a good idea. In most cases, there is at least one case where it's a good idea. So, things really started to change. Within 100 years of the death of Newton, Laplace famously says to Napoleon when asked where God fits into his physics, he said, so I have no need of God to do physics. And he was right, because the methodology, the so-called scientific method, which is a gross simplification, it wasn't necessary. You had a methodology. Do the experiments. When you've got a set of results that don't fit with the current models, propose some new ones, test them and experiment, and you move on bit by bit. That's what reductionism is. It's the idea that you can just get by things that can be measured. And, of course, in terms of economic and scientific advancement, that's true. Russians with their Marxist philosophy, Indians and Chinese with the Tao in Chinese and Marxism on top of it, and Hinduism, all much more fatalistic. They can all put people on the moon. They can all make rockets, etc. The physics is independent of the faith at that level. But what Occam understood was that the important things like love, truth, honor, justice, these things can't be measured. Does that mean they're unimportant? Of course they're not. You only have to ask a student group, when your last boyfriend or girlfriend jilted you, did you feel bad? Was it something real? You bet it was. And when your parents walk away from you and say, oh, you'll get over divorce, it's all right, everybody's doing it. No, it's not good news. When Johnson bribed black women in the inner city with pensions for single mothers, but if her husband was there, they didn't get anything. Now, everybody can predict what happened, and it did happen, but as Denzel Washington says, the problem comes from that. Black boys in the inner city grow up without a male role model. So they go looking for one on the streets, and as he says, we all know where that leads, where it has led. Ideas have consequences, and what I've been sketching for you at this stage is how long it can take for those consequences to emerge, but they have this power to just go on and roll away everything in their way that comes in their way. And then we look at the consequences and say, oh, what a problem. So Weaver's book, Ideas Have Consequences, a little book, but it had a huge impact, worth reading. So what Occam did was to say, he tried to help God out. God didn't need his help, but he divided the world up and said, there are things that cannot be measured, and we put them over here. And the things that can be measured, we'll put them over there. So things like love, joy, peace, justice were put in the area that science couldn't touch. But it's not a good idea to fracture the world like that, as it turned out over time. Now we're looking at one of the long-term effects of that. When I began doing science, there were so few people that did science in medicine in those days that basically all the people who were making any real progress knew one another. Nobody even dreamt of fabricating data. There were one or two early clever people. Psychiatry, of course, where it's easier to do. But by and large, no. Faraday said you do the experiments and you publish the results and leave it at that. And people do what they can with it, and you do what you can with it. Now, we have no idea what proportion of the literature is fabricated. There's a lot of literature coming out at the moment on irreproducibility. You repeat experiments and you can't get the same result. And that's the only, when somebody comes along and says, this is where we're going, you need to go back and look. See, the COVID thing went beyond the bounds of the science. When somebody says the science is in, the one thing you know is they don't know what science is. The science is never in the sense of being complete. What you've done may be correct at a certain level, but then you've got to go on and to the next phase. But particularly the social sciences are not rigorous. And having that lovely moment when Peterson's career took off when he was interviewed on British television, and the woman very smart woman who'd made her career basically taking clever but somewhat inarticulate men down, and she was good, as all the politicians are, with language but not with truth. And she got to the usual tired old thing about women being paid less for the same work. And Peace just destroyed her by saying something, about multifactorial analysis. Yes, women earn less in the same job as men, but if you put one other variable, hours worked, into it, now the women are being paid more. What do you do? You've got to deal with these things. You can't run away from it. So that's reductionism, and you will see it everywhere. Nothing buttery is what Donald Mackay calls it, and it's a nice example. Nothing buttery. The example I told you about the other week of the scientist looking out to sea at night and seeing a light flashing, and one's got his little laboratory and he tells you all these perfectly true things, and he's saying that light is nothing but this physics. But then the other scientist, who's a parable for the Christian, brings in some authority from outside. He said, remember the Norse code. Slowly he puts it together and he realizes that the light is saying, the bit of cliff you're sitting on is about to collapse into the sea, get off. The scientists had got all the data but he missed the message. Because, of course, the message, this is problematic. It's one of the reasons why molecular biology is now an area populated by people less willing to argue against God, because they don't win the argument if they do it not with an undergraduate, but with somebody who's gone down that route and come out the other end. It is astonishing that every living creature has the same DNA code. Some use RNA in the viruses, but it's the same one. And what a system it is. It's a 4-letter code that works in 3-letter combinations, which will give you amino acid start or stop, to simplify greatly. So a triplet can say start at, if you did it in numbers, 1, 2, 3 could be the start. It says start at 4, go 4, 5, 6. In triplets for about 300, and you've got basically a protein, because each triplet is an amino acid. They link to one another, and away you go. But you can't explain that. How could that evolve? It didn't evolve. It's impossible that the things we've discovered now could have come about by time plus chance. Neither the jump from inorganic to organic, nor the development of DNA are statistically possible. And fortunately, when mathematicians turn up in this area like John Lennox, they make it very plain. It's over. Wonderful. I actually was given a foresight of that, because I think I've told the story, but if I haven't, you can write to me afterwards. But I was given an insight into DNA debating in Cuba, I don't know, 20 years ago. And God suddenly showed me how to do it. And when I laid out what I've just said, the whole audience burst into applause, because they'd lived under scientific socialism, totally reductive. And they'd had enough. So they were happy to see me take it apart. But they're still falling apart today. Now, once that view has taken place, the usual errors made in society are errors of hierarchy, good things in wrong places, making the wrong card trump, so to speak. If you want to think about this in a group, you can't do better, I think, as a starter than this book, A Refutation of Moral Relativism by Peter Kraft. He's a brilliant teacher, and I'm just going to read you a bit, and I see I've already, this is past the length that the people who do these things tell you should do, but so be it. What he does, he writes dialogues, usually between Socrates and students or abortionists or whatever, but he's also written this in this one. He's done something very clever. He doesn't bring Socrates in this time, but he has a sassy black feminist arguing with a thoughtful Muslim scientist. Scientist is called Isa, and the feminist is Libby. And I'll just read to you a little bit, starting at page 17, if you want to go and find it, if you get the book. So Isa says this: so you do want me to start arguing instead of just explaining the importance of the issue? Libby: no, just explain how you see the social importance of the issue first. Isa: why first? It isn't first, it's second. Second to what? To philosophy, says Libby. Isa: second to people, to individuals. Societies are made by people, made of people, and made for people. Or have you forgotten President Lincoln's formula? Government of the people, by the people, for the people. There you are. He's destroyed the current politics of identity. It's not the right way to go. This is how it goes on. Oh, that's a great formula, and I love it too. No, I didn't mean government first or politics first. I meant let's look at society first, culture first, then the individual who conditioned is conditioned by the culture. The people first, then the person. Livy says, but suppose I don't believe the group should be first before the individual. Livy, I only asked you to address the social question first. I didn't ask you to believe that society really does come first or really should come first. Just a question and approach. The one most Americans would take, I think. So if you want to meet them where they are coming from, well, meet them there. Well, Isa, all right, let's see where to start. Let's start in Auschwitz. That's the fruits of moral relativism. Is that relevant enough for you? You haven't proved the connection, Professor, says Libby. You've just assigned the blame, dogmatically blamed Auschwitz on your favourite whipping boy, moral relativism. Why not blame it on moral absolutism? Isa, you want evidence then? You want concrete evidence? I'll let Mussolini answer the question, okay? Here, let me find a quotation. Mussolini was something of a philosopher, you know. Here it is. Listen to what he wrote. Everything I have said and done in these last years is relativism by intuition. If relativism signifies contempt for fixed categories and men who claim to be the bearers of an objective, immortal truth, then there is nothing more relativistic than the fascistic attitudes and activity. From the fact that all ideologies are of equal value, all ideologies are mere fiction. The modern relativist infers that everybody has the right to create for himself his own theology and to attempt to enforce it with all the energy of which he is capable. That's from Mussolini's D.U. Turner. Libby, but Professor, America isn't fascist. America isn't Auschwitz. Are you saying it is? No, I'm not, says Isa, but I'm saying it's buying into a philosophy that led to Auschwitz in Germany. And you can see that was written. Let me look it up. This is quite an old book, published by Ignatius, 1999. He got there first, didn't he? Once you say that only physical facts occur, have validity, then moral ideas are up for grabs. And you're seeing what's happening. And the people who are most articulate tend to win the argument, regardless of whether they're right or not. Now, it can take years and years to sort that out. It's not quick. The book to read to give you a start on that, I've asked you to read it several times, but nobody has yet written to me to say they've done it and how valuable it was, is The Abolition of Man, only 120 pages or thereabouts. So once you started thinking that physical facts are all that really mattered, moral facts were sidelined, moral facts became your opinions, i.e. relativism. The idea that there's an absolute moral truth doesn't fit in that story. And so you get to the point where, well, my idea is that there are multiple genders and I have 95 pronouns and you must accommodate me. You have to go a long way back to stop that argument. And your children and grandchildren have to learn how to do it. Now, as I predicted, I have not got very far, have I? We'll have to come back to it next week. And I haven't touched the Sermon on the Mount this week, which is a pity, but I will get back to it because it actually fits in with this, but probably next week or the week after. Have a wonderful week, utterly discomforted as to whether you actually have a modern mind or a Christian one, until you find out by prayer and reading and searching and thinking where you should be standing. God bless you all.